At 12:29 a.m., a mother dialed 911 and said someone had broken into her home. By sunrise, 2 children were dead. By the end of the week, their mother was gone, vanished across an ocean. And what police would later hear from the one child who survived would turn this from a burglary call into one of the most disturbing family crime cases Colorado Springs has ever seen. This is Kimberlee Singler. And this is the case of the extradited mom. Kimberlee Singler, the case of the extradited mom. The house sat quietly on a cold December night in Colorado Springs. No flashing lights. No screams echoing through the street. Just another residential home, dark, still, unremarkable. Until the call came in. Kimberlee Singler told dispatchers that an intruder had broken into her home. She said there had been a struggle. She said someone had attacked her and her children. When police arrived, what they found would change everything. Inside the home were 3 children. Only one of them was still alive. Her 9-year-old daughter was dead. Her 7-year-old son was dead. Both had suffered violent injuries no parent should ever have to explain. Standing nearby was Kimberlee Singler, injured, shaken, alive. At first, she was treated as a victim. She told officers a masked man had broken in. She said she fought him. She said he attacked her children before fleeing into the night. And for a brief moment, police believed her. There were no arrests, no immediate charges, no handcuffs. Instead, Kimberlee Singler was taken to the hospital, while detectives began the slow, methodical work of examining the scene. That's when the story started to crack. There were no signs of forced entry, no trail leading away from the house, no evidence that supported the presence of a stranger. And then, there was the surviving child. An 11-year-old girl who had initially repeated her mother's story, until she didn't. What she would later tell investigators would stop the investigation cold, and send it in an entirely new direction. Because according to her, the danger never came from outside the house. It was already inside. Within days, police issued an arrest warrant. But when they went looking for Kimberlee Singler, she was gone. Not hiding nearby. Not laying low in another state. She had left the country, crossed an ocean, and set off an international manhunt that would drag this case into courtrooms on 2 continents. This was no longer just a murder investigation. It was now a race for justice, before the truth disappeared forever. Welcome to Coziness Stories. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and make yourself at home. Before she became a name in headlines, before extradition papers and murder charges, Kimberlee Singler was just another mother navigating a broken family. She lived in Colorado Springs with her children while locked in a tense custody dispute with her ex-husband. The relationship had ended badly. Court filings described escalating conflict, arguments over visitation, control, and who had authority over the children's lives. By late 2023, pressure inside the Singler household was building. There were upcoming custody exchanges, court involvement, deadlines that couldn't be avoided. Friends later described Kimberlee as increasingly overwhelmed. Financial stress, emotional strain, fear of losing control. And in custody cases like this, control matters. Especially when one parent believes the system is about to take something away. Investigators would later look closely at what Kimberlee stood to lose in the days ahead. Because just before the killings, court proceedings were moving forward. Schedules were set. Decisions were looming. And according to prosecutors, that timing was no coincidence. There was also something else. Kimberlee had been telling people she felt betrayed, that she was being treated unfairly, that no one was listening to her. And when people feel cornered, when they believe everything is about to be taken, they sometimes make decisions that can't be undone. By the night of December 19, 2023, whatever balance still existed inside that home was gone. And by morning, 2 children would never wake up again. The crime scene didn't scream burglary. It whispered something else. When detectives returned to the house, after the ambulances, after the chaos, they slowed everything down. Every room, every surface, every detail. And almost immediately, problems emerged. There was no forced entry, no broken doors, no shattered windows, no pry marks, nothing that suggested a stranger had ever come inside. Then there was the layout of the house. Investigators mapped the movement Kimberlee Singler claimed had happened, the struggle, the attack, the escape. But the physical evidence didn't support it. There were no muddy footprints leading away from the home, no blood trail heading toward an exit, no signs of someone fleeing into the cold Colorado night. What was present was contained to the inside of the house, contained to specific rooms, Contained in a way that suggested the violence didn't erupt suddenly, it unfolded. Detectives also noticed something else. Kimberlee's injuries. She had visible wounds, but according to investigators, they didn't match the level of violence inflicted on the children. The disparity mattered. In cases involving alleged intruders, attackers don't usually stop short. They don't carefully choose who survives. And yet, Kimberlee Singler was alive. Her children were not. As investigators processed the scene, one question kept coming up. If this was a random attack, why did it look so personal? Then came the interviews. Friends, neighbors, family members. And slowly, a picture began to form that didn't align with the frantic 911 call. Kimberlee had been under intense stress. There had been ongoing conflict with her ex-husband, custody issues that hadn't gone her way. And according to people close to the family, tensions inside the home had been escalating, not easing. But the most important interview hadn't happened yet, because there was still one person in that house who saw everything. An 11-year-old girl. At first, she told police what she thought she was supposed to say. She repeated her mother's account, that a stranger came in, that everything happened fast, that it was chaos. But trauma has a way of cracking rehearsed stories. And as investigators gently pressed for clarity, asking the same questions again in different ways, something shifted. Her answers began to change. Details didn't line up. And eventually, she stopped protecting the story. What she told detectives next would end the burglary theory forever. Because according to her, there was no masked intruder. No stranger. No escape. The person who hurt her siblings never left the house. And when detectives realized what she was saying, this case stopped being about who broke in, and became about who was standing right there all along. Investigators knew this moment mattered. They didn't rush it. They didn't push. An 11-year-old girl had just lost her brother and sister in the most violent way imaginable. Whatever truth she carried, it would surface on its own time. At first, her words echoed her mother's. A stranger. A man in the house. A blur of fear. But trauma doesn't stay still. And stories built under fear rarely survive scrutiny. As detectives gently revisited the timeline, asking her to walk through the night again, step by step, something shifted. Her voice slowed. Her answers shortened. Then came the pause. She told investigators she hadn't told them everything before. She said she was scared. And then she said something that would change the case forever. She told them her mother was the one who hurt her siblings. Not an intruder. Not a stranger. Her mom. She described being told to stay in her room. She described sounds that didn't match a break-in. She described fear that came from someone she knew. And then came the sentence investigators would later repeat in court filings. She said her mother told her, "God told me to do it." The room went silent. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't imagination. This was a child recounting something she had no reason, or benefit, to invent. Investigators immediately shifted the case. Kimberlee Singler was no longer a grieving victim. She was now the primary suspect. Detectives re-examined every piece of evidence through that lens. The lack of forced entry. The contained nature of the violence. The inconsistencies in Kimberlee's injuries. It all made sense now. But there was a problem. Kimberlee Singler was no longer where police expected her to be. When investigators moved to arrest her, they discovered she had already started pulling away. Phone activity stopped. Contact with friends ended. Plans were quietly canceled. She wasn't preparing to face questions. She was preparing to disappear. And by the time police made the call, Kimberlee Singler had already left. What she did next would transform this case from a local homicide into an international pursuit. Because instead of turning herself in, she crossed an ocean. If this story is drawing you in, subscribing to Coziness Stories helps you enjoy more tales like this every time you return. Once the child's statement was documented, everything moved fast. Too fast. Detectives no longer debated what had happened inside that house. They were now racing against where the suspect was going next. Based on the evidence and the surviving child's account, police prepared an arrest warrant for Kimberlee Singler. The charges were severe. The implications irreversible. But when officers went to locate her, she wasn't there. Her phone no longer rang. Messages went unanswered. Friends hadn't heard from her. And that's when investigators realized something chilling. Kimberlee Singler wasn't confused. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was running. Records showed sudden activity, travel preparations that didn't match panic or grief. There were no goodbyes. No explanations. Just distance. Within days of her children's deaths, Kimberlee Singler had left the United States. Not quietly slipping to another state. Not hiding with family. She had crossed the Atlantic. When authorities confirmed her location, it sent shockwaves through the case. She was in London. Now the question wasn't just why she left. It was how. How does a woman accused of murdering her children escape the country before an arrest? How many systems failed in those crucial hours? And most importantly, why London? As US investigators scrambled, British authorities were alerted. Interpol notices were issued. Extradition discussions began. What should have been a straightforward arrest had now become a diplomatic and legal maze. Meanwhile, back in Colorado Springs, 2 children were gone forever. And the woman accused of killing them was walking free, thousands of miles away. But not for long. Because once law enforcement knew where she was, they weren't going to let her disappear again. For nearly a week, Kimberlee Singler lived as if nothing had happened. While investigators in Colorado Springs worked through evidence and grief, she was thousands of miles away, moving through one of the busiest cities in the world. London. Crowded. Anonymous. Perfect for disappearing. But she wasn't as invisible as she thought. Once US authorities confirmed she had left the country, the case escalated instantly. Federal agents were brought in. British law enforcement was notified. Paperwork moved fast because it had to. This was no longer just a domestic homicide. It was an international flight from justice. On December 30th, British police located Kimberlee Singler in the Chelsea area of London, an upscale neighborhood far removed from the violence left behind in Colorado. There was no dramatic chase. No resistance. When officers approached her, she didn't run. She was taken into custody calmly. And just like that, the woman who had vanished after her children's deaths was behind bars, this time on foreign soil. But the arrest was only the beginning. Because under British law, an arrest does not automatically mean extradition. Kimberlee Singler still had a legal path forward. A path that could keep her out of the United States and away from an American courtroom for years. As news of her capture spread back home, families waited. Prosecutors waited. And the surviving child waited. But in London, a new battle was about to begin. One that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. And everything to do with whether she would ever be forced to come back. She was finally caught, but that didn't mean she was coming home. Not yet. In London, Kimberlee Singler wasn't sitting in a jail cell thinking about Colorado Springs. She was thinking about one thing only: how to stay in the UK. Because extradition is not automatic. And for defendants accused of serious crimes, it can become a long, strategic war. Inside a British courtroom, Kimberlee's legal team moved fast. They argued that sending her back to the United States would violate her human rights. That American prisons were too harsh. That the emotional and psychological toll would be unbearable. This is a common defense tactic in international cases, and sometimes it works. Especially when the charges involve life sentences. Especially when the accused is a mother. But prosecutors on the US side came prepared. They laid out the facts clearly and relentlessly. 2 children dead. A 3rd child severely injured. A crime scene inconsistent with self-defense. A suspect who fled the country immediately after. Then came the detail that changed everything. She didn't flee randomly. Authorities revealed that Kimberlee had planned the escape. She had obtained travel documents in advance. She had researched international routes. She had timed her departure before charges were formally filed. This wasn't panic. It was calculation. And British officials were listening closely. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was shifting. Media coverage in both countries framed the same question over and over. If she's innocent, why run? As the hearings continued, the judge issued a temporary ruling. Kimberlee Singler would remain in British custody. No bail. No release. No return, yet. But the walls were closing in. Because with every day that passed, the evidence from Colorado grew stronger. And soon the UK court would have to decide. Protect her rights. Or send her back to face the consequences. When the judge spoke, Kimberlee Singler didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just closed her eyes, because she already knew what was coming. The escape was over. The British courtroom was silent when the ruling came down. After weeks of legal arguments, delays, and appeals, the judge addressed the final question. Should Kimberlee Singler be extradited to the United States to face charges for the deaths of her children? The answer was short, direct, unforgiving. Yes. The court ruled that the U.S. charges were credible and serious. There was sufficient evidence linking Kimberlee to the crime. Extradition would not violate her human rights. The United States had provided adequate assurances regarding her treatment. There would be no safe haven, no technical loophole, no last-minute miracle. Kimberlee Singler would be sent back to Colorado. As the judge finished reading, reporters noted something chilling. She didn't react like someone relieved to finally tell her story. She reacted like someone who had just lost control. Her shoulders slumped. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. For the first time since her arrest, she looked afraid. Back in Colorado Springs, prosecutors moved immediately. A flight was arranged. Security protocols were finalized. An arrest warrant waited on the other side of the Atlantic. This wasn't just a return, it was a handoff. British authorities would escort her to the airport. U.S. Marshals would take custody mid-journey. From that moment on, Kimberlee Singler would be a defendant, not a fugitive. Meanwhile, investigators reopened every file. Crime scene photos were re-examined. 911 recordings were replayed. Medical examiner reports were reviewed line by line. And one thing stood out more clearly than ever. The story Kimberlee told that night didn't just have holes. It had contradictions. Contradictions that couldn't be explained away by shock, trauma, or confusion. As news of the extradition spread, public reaction exploded. Some asked how a mother could do this. Others asked how she almost got away with it. Many asked the hardest question of all. Were there warning signs that everyone missed? Because once she landed back in the U.S., there would be no hiding behind distance. No foreign courts. No delays. Only a courtroom. A jury. And the truth, whatever it turned out to be. Halfway over the Atlantic, the handcuffs were checked again. Not because Kimberlee Singler tried to run, but because this was the moment she realized there was no country left to hide in. The transfer was quiet by design. No press at the airport. No dramatic statements. Just controlled movement, sealed documents, and federal custody. British officers escorted Kimberlee Singler onto the plane in silence. She was dressed plainly. No makeup. No jewelry. Her wrists were cuffed low, hidden beneath a jacket. Mid-flight, U.S. Marshals took over. That moment mattered. Because from then on, everything changed legally. From that point forward, every word she spoke could be used against her in an American court. She was read her rights. She said nothing. Not about the children. Not about Colorado Springs. Not about the night everything ended. According to officials later, she stared out the window for most of the flight. No tears. No visible panic. Just stillness. But investigators knew better. This wasn't calm. It was calculation. When the plane landed in the United States, time seemed to compress. She was transferred directly into federal custody. No public appearance. No chance to address the media. By the time most people learned she had landed, Kimberlee Singler was already en route to Colorado. And waiting there were the same detectives who had first stepped into that apartment months earlier. The same ones who had walked through blood-stained rooms. The same ones who had listened to her original story and quietly written inconsistencies in their notes. Now they would hear it again. The interrogation room was small. Neutral colors. A table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs. Camera recording everything. Detectives began carefully. They didn't accuse her. They didn't raise their voices. They asked her to explain, again, what happened that night. Kimberlee repeated parts of her original account. She said she was attacked. She said she fought for her life. She said she didn't remember everything clearly. But this time investigators had more. They had medical reports contradicting defensive injuries, scene reconstruction analysis that challenged her timeline, forensic findings that suggested the children were harmed before the alleged struggle. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her story began to shift. Times changed. Details blurred. Certain questions were met with long pauses. At one point, a detective slid a photograph across the table. Not graphic. Just enough. Kimberlee looked down, then looked away, and said 4 words investigators had been waiting for. "I don't want to talk anymore." The interview ended immediately. Because that sentence wasn't innocence. It was strategy. Outside the room, prosecutors were already preparing the next step. Formal charges. Court appearances. A case that would soon move from investigation to judgment. And looming over everything was the question no one could answer yet. What would a jury believe, her story or the evidence? Because once the trial began, there would be no rewriting timelines. No international delays. No escape. Only testimony. And consequences. By the time prosecutors stood before the judge, they weren't asking if Kimberlee Singler killed her children. They were preparing to prove how, and why her story could no longer survive the evidence. The courtroom was silent when the prosecution began outlining its case. No theatrics. No emotional language. Just facts. And in true crime, facts are the most dangerous thing of all. The prosecution's theory was simple, but devastating. Kimberlee Singler did not survive a violent home invasion. She staged one. They argued that the crime scene inside the Colorado Springs apartment told a very different story than the one she reported that night. According to forensic analysts, the blood patterns were inconsistent with a struggle between adults. There were no signs of forced entry. Injuries on Kimberlee's body did not align with defensive wounds. Some injuries appeared self-inflicted or superficial. Then came the most critical point: the children. Medical examiners testified that the timing of the children's injuries suggested they were harmed before the alleged fight Kimberlee described. That detail mattered, because it dismantled her narrative completely. If the children were attacked first, then Kimberlee's claim of reacting to an intruder collapsed. And the jury would eventually hear that. Prosecutors also focused heavily on behavior. Not just what Kimberlee said, but what she did. They laid out a timeline showing delays in calling for help, conflicting statements given to first responders, a lack of panic consistent with the severity of the scene. One detective testified, "Her story never stayed still. Every time we clarified one detail, another changed." The prosecution didn't say she was lying. They let the contradictions speak for themselves. Then came the extradition evidence. Emails, travel records, digital footprints. Prosecutors argued that fleeing to the UK wasn't fear, it was intent. Because innocent people don't cross oceans to avoid court. They show up. Kimberlee sat motionless through most of the hearing, occasionally whispering to her attorney, never looking toward the families seated behind the prosecution. The judge listened carefully, then set the next phase in motion. Trial. No more speculation. No more sealed documents. This case would now unfold in public. Outside the courthouse, the story exploded. National headlines, true crime podcasts, social media debates splitting instantly into two camps. She's guilty. The system failed her. But inside the courtroom, opinion didn't matter. Only proof. And the prosecution believed they had enough to tell a jury exactly what happened inside that apartment, step by step. But there was one thing they still hadn't shown: motive. And that would be the most uncomfortable chapter of all. Stories feel better when shared. Subscribe to Coziness Stories and join a space made for quiet moments and deep stories. If the prosecution painted Kimberlee Singler as a calculating killer, the defense had a different word for her: victim. And what they revealed next forced the courtroom to confront a far more uncomfortable possibility. When the defense finally stood, they didn't begin with evidence. They began with a question. What does a mother look like after unimaginable trauma? They argued that the prosecution had mistaken chaos for calculation, and grief for guilt. The defense's strategy was clear from the start. They were not trying to prove what happened inside the apartment. They were trying to prove what it did to her. According to the defense, Kimberlee Singler was a woman under extreme psychological strain long before that night. They introduced records showing ongoing custody disputes, documented stress related to finances and housing, prior reports of fear and instability. Then came the most critical claim: that Kimberlee was suffering from acute trauma response, a psychological state where memory fractures, timelines blur, and behavior becomes unpredictable. In other words, inconsistency does not automatically mean deception. The defense directly addressed the issue of fleeing to the UK. They did not deny it. Instead, they reframed it. They argued Kimberlee did not run because she was guilty. She ran because she believed she would never survive the American justice system as a woman accused of harming her own children. They reminded the court, fear does not look rational. Trauma does not make logical choices. Then came the emotional pivot. The defense played a recording from early interviews, before lawyers, before extradition, before headlines. Kimberlee's voice shook as she spoke about her children. She cried. She paused. She repeated herself. The defense argued this wasn't manipulation. It was shock. They also challenged the forensic conclusions. Expert witnesses testified that blood pattern analysis is not absolute. Injuries can appear inconsistent under panic-driven movement. Crime scenes involving children often defy clean reconstruction. One expert stated plainly, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The courtroom shifted, because now the case was no longer about certainty. It was about doubt. The defense closed their chapter with one final argument. The prosecution wanted the jury to believe Kimberlee planned everything. But planning requires clarity. And nothing about that night, the injuries, the timeline, the emotional collapse, suggested a clear mind. Only a broken one. Kimberlee finally looked up. For the first time since extradition, she scanned the courtroom. Not at the jury. Not at the judge. But at the empty space where her children should have been. The judge adjourned the session. But the damage was done. This case was no longer simple. And the verdict, when it comes, will divide the country. When the courtroom doors closed, 12 strangers were left alone with one question. Was Kimberlee Singler a mother who survived the unimaginable, or the person who caused it? There would be no middle ground. The judge's voice was steady as she gave the jury their final instructions. No emotion. No commentary. Just the law. They were told to ignore headlines. Ignore social media. Ignore public outrage. Their task was narrower and heavier. Decide whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not suspicion. Not discomfort. Not disbelief. Proof. The prosecution went first. They returned to structure. Timelines. Forensics. Behavior. They walked the jury back through the night of the killings, minute by minute. They reminded them. No intruder was ever found. No forced entry was documented. No credible suspect existed outside Kimberlee herself. They ended with one sentence that lingered in the air. Stories can change. Evidence does not. Then the defense stood. They didn't replay the crime scene. They replayed the human cost. They spoke of trauma, panic, fear, and how the justice system has a long history of misunderstanding women in crisis, especially mothers. They warned the jury. If you convict based on disbelief instead of proof, you don't deliver justice. You create a precedent. They asked the jury to remember that the burden of proof belonged to the state, not to a grieving mother. Hours passed, then days. Outside the courthouse, cameras stayed rolling. Online debates turned vicious. She planned it. She snapped. She's innocent. She ran. But inside the jury room, none of that mattered. Only evidence. Only doubt. Only conscience. Kimberlee waited, sometimes staring straight ahead, sometimes closing her eyes. No tears. No visible reaction. Just stillness. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to say. At the time of this telling, the case has not reached its final chapter in real life. No verdict has closed the book. No sentence has sealed the outcome. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. Because justice in this case is still unfolding. If Kimberlee Singler is convicted, America will call it accountability. If she is acquitted, many will call it failure. But no verdict, guilty or not, will bring back 2 children. And no courtroom decision will ever fully answer the hardest question of all. What truly happened behind that door? If this story stayed with you, that's because it's still happening. And in true crime, the most disturbing cases are the ones that don't end cleanly. Subscribe for more stories where truth, power, and silence collide. Comment below, what do you think the jury should decide and why?